Wow, so today's news on the official blog wasn't something to do with World versus World or Masteries or some mechanical thing. It was actually a lore post, and it's been a damn long time since we've seen one of these. Today I want to talk about this with you guys. It wasn't one of their old version like story posts, but it absolutely does dive into the plot to do with one specific element of the Maguma jungle, and that is the Exalted. Before I go into the video, I will warn you, as much as I hate to send people away, this did kind of, to me, feel a little on the spoilery side. Like, it's not big spoilers for the plot, but it is the kind of thing, and it's rare for me to think this, that I was kind of thinking to myself, wow, this would have been kind of cool to just find out as the story goes along. So maybe save yourselves on this one, but we got a lot of interesting discussion to do, and some answers finally about one of the core races that featured in Heart of Thorns, those being the Exalted. So, for the longest time, it's been pretty wide speculation that these kind of mechanical creatures, these Exalted that we've seen throughout the trailers and with the mastery of their own and popping up every now and then, it's been a fairly well understood theory that they could be the Mursaat, like a new version of the Mursaat, maybe not exactly the same Mursaat that we wiped out in Guild Wars 1, but a branch of the Mursaat who maybe hid in the mist and have now just re-arrived, and for some reason are allied to us at least some of the time, because, hey, the Mursaat were always kind of a shade of grey anyway, and maybe they could have been playing into that. Well, they're not Mursaat at all. The Exalted, rather, are constructs of energy and magic built by the Forgotten, who are essentially humans that have sacrificed their souls to become immortals, undying entities, destined to carry out Glint's legacy and her plan, her failsafe, for the Elder Dragons Rising. Yeah, that's a pretty crazy story, and actually, if you really think about that, I think I prefer that to the thought that they're the Mursaat coming back into the franchise. Now, many of us long-time fans of the franchise have, of course, been looking forward to them, of course, been looking at the setups ArenaNet have been doing with the White Mantle and the idea of New Kryta, and the fact that there were always these Mursaat hints about the Tarnished Coast, and we were kind of going back to the jungle and the Tarnished Coast. The fact that the architecture that these Exalted seem to interact with in that initial trailer, and they make it look all golden and bright and glowing, seems to be very much like the ruins we found on the Tarnished Coast, which the Asurans named Ratasum, which is an anagram for Mursaat. And given that the Exalted's buildings appear to be golden, and the earliest example we've ever heard of a Mursaat city was that it was also golden, it kind of made sense, and a lot of us were pushing for it. But what kind of place would they have had in this story? I was most excited by the thought of them being a part of it because they seem kind of distant, kind of separate, and then you suddenly just throw them all together with this plot of tackling Morgemoth, and you see what happens. But that doesn't necessarily mean it would have been a great story. The Exalted, on the other hand, and this setup that ArenaNet have given to us, basically, as far as we the players are concerned, we're being introduced to a totally new faction, a totally new race here, if you can consider them that. What ArenaNet have actually done is designed a group that are much more involved in the story. Their entire creation is around the purpose of dealing with the Elder Dragons, and so that makes them a much better fit. Anyway, we'll talk more about the Mursaat later, but let's just jump straight into the blog post itself here. I'm not going to read it verbatim for you guys. If you'd like to do that before we get on with some speculation, you'll find the link in the description down below. But until then, here is my picking out of some of the most important stuff. So the post itself is called The Exalted Pure Dedication. Meet the Exalted, bearers of Glint's legacy. We get a couple of images of them, and they describe that deep in the wilds of Maguma, under canopy so thick that midday often seems like midnight, there is a shining golden city called Tarir, and it was established by the Forgotten, an ancient race known for its powerful magics and even more powerful mysteries. This is a city with a noble and glorious purpose. The Forgotten knew that they couldn't achieve that purpose without help, so they also created a race of gleaming, magically enhanced operatives to see their plans to fruition, and those are the Exalted. So there are some cool little confirmations here as well, actually. Number one, that Glint absolutely was prophetic. There's been some, not necessarily theories I subscribe to, but there's been some interesting discussion out there as to whether she really was prophetic, or she just made up the Flameseeker prophecies, hoping to manipulate the world into what eventually happened in the downfall of the Mursaat in the first game. But this absolutely says, you know, she was prophetic, and because she was prophetic, she could set up a really long-term plan. Once she was freed from Kralkatorric's influence by the Forgotten, it seems they kind of started to work for her. I'm not quite sure how that power shift happened, but she became a friend to living things, and she decided she wanted to see them survive the next Elder Dragon Rising. So about 50 years before the events of Guild Wars 1, that's 300 years before the current events today, she sent the Forgotten out to find humans who would want to secure this peaceful future. In theory, she sends them the Forgotten out. The Forgotten find humans, and they say, all right, Elder Dragons this, Elder Dragons that. Will you help us? They say yes, and then those humans undergo a set of trials. I'm guessing that these tests and trials, by the way, could be something that we end up experiencing as the story goes along, right? Not necessarily to become exalted, mind you, but just because it seems like one of those fun things they could do given this story. And these humans, once they are kind of proven worthy, they give up their souls. They kind of shed their regular form and they become exalted. The changes that they undergo basically mean that now they're immortal. Immortal, by the way, doesn't necessarily mean you can't be killed. It just means you won't die through aging, and that they're very durable. In fact, ArenaNet specifically say this in the post, and they say that they can still be killed by violence or by draining their essential magic. It's really interesting that they say or draining their essential magic, because of course we know that Morgemorth seeks magic, the Elder Dragons seek magic, and here we've got a race that not only seems to just be built of magic, right? And are specifically weak to that being drained of them, but even their city, Tarir, also is full of magic. So the blog doesn't really go into this detail, but I think it's fair to speculate that Morgemorth is going to view that as a very tasty snack. Despite these changes that happen to these humans, they do actually preserve their names, their personalities, their memories. It's just now they're these badass things that don't have to eat or sleep. This is really cool, actually, because they set up this idea that you have Exalted that work as pairs to defend or support outposts that they've created within the jungle. And the fact that these people still have all their memories, their personalities and so forth, kind of means you can actually have really interesting characters. You can have this pair maybe even fall in love or something, and then they're still going to experience loss, and we'll be able to feel for them. What's kind of cool to me as a lorehead is these are humans who were alive 50 years before the start of Guild Wars 1, and they have memories of Tyria from 50 years before Guild Wars 1. In fact, across their whole lives, they will probably value and want to remember and hold on to what they were as a human more than anything else. So we can get some really interesting human stories from just before GW1, and there could be any number of fantastic stories we get from them there. Like, oh, I don't know, what's this game called again? Guild Wars? Right, yeah, weren't those going on around about that time? That'd be cool. So, what exactly are they trying to do? The blog post isn't totally clear about this, so we move a little more into the realm of speculation here. But we hear that the Master of Peace was, who was carrying this dragon egg, okay, given to him as we saw in Living World Season 2 by some mysterious stranger. He is carrying this egg, and specifically he's trying to take it to the city the Exalted have built in the jungle. And as he does this, that is when they stir and they wake up. See, some of you guys might be wondering, alright, look, we went to the Maguma jungle in GW1. We never saw any of the Exalted here. We never saw signs of a giant city here. Are they really just going to make out like this stuff randomly and happily has always existed? Well, the story here is that after Glint set these people up in the jungle, they forged a few alliances, and then they just kind of stopped and they waited. They didn't know how long till the Elder Dragons would be waking up. And so if you guys remember back to the original trailer we had for Heart of Thorns, it kind of showed one of these Exalted going over to one of these ruins we'd previously been speculating had something to do with the Mursaat, and kind of activating it and turning it all really golden very quickly. Presumably this is the idea that they were kind of in hiding while they were dormant. This is why we never saw them in the past 250 years or at any point until now. And they kind of concealed themselves by making their golden-looking buildings look old and ruined. Presumably just as easily as they made this look gold in the trailer, they could actually do the opposite and make it go from looking gold to very old. And that's actually got kind of a nice little touch to it, because one of the older mysteries has been, who do these ruins on the Tarnished Coast and around the Maguma jungle belong to? And we always thought it was, you know, some ancient race that had passed a long time ago and disappeared now. And people then thought that could have been the Mursaat because of Ratasum's name or whatever. But instead, this is kind of a funny idea that actually these ruins aren't old at all. They're kind of new ruins. They're only 50 years old, but they've just been made to look very old. And so should this speculation come true, that would kind of answer one of the longest standing mysteries we've had, at least since Eye of the North, about who built these ruins on the Tarnished Coast that the, you know, Asura would come to the surface and ultimately find. So what did they want to do with the egg? Well, the blog post doesn't really say. They say once Tyria was completed and ready to receive Glint's legacy, her offspring, the Exalted began to go dormant in order to conserve their magical resources until they were needed. After the egg began to stir, they woke up, But when they woke up, they found that Morgemoth was already awake. The jungle dragon's minions were everywhere. They realized that some of their old allies had been gone. The jungle was more dangerous than they remembered. And, all they can do is watch on when the packed fleet is suddenly destroyed. So they know that they have allies out there, people who are fighting for them, these, stranded members of the pact. But they are more against the wall than perhaps they were originally expected. And the blog says that some even wonder if their August duty was doomed to fail just as it was getting started. You know what's really nice about this, and I think one of the reasons why this idea of the Exalted as a race, rather than them just being like a branch of Mursaat, excites me so much, it's that because this is like their calling and what they were created for, yeah, this is just them getting started. This race doesn't just have to have prominence for us against Morgemoth, but should things go okay against Morgemoth, they're still going to be invested, maybe reveal to us more golden cities or locations and plans and things elsewhere around the world when it comes to the other dragons too. Maybe even shed some light on places like these other golden looking places we've seen, like Augury Rock or the Hall of the Heroes. That's really cool. They can be a persistent part of this game for a long time into the future. That's the setup. To move into speculation now, I believe the idea must be, because there's so much magical influence around this city, that the Masterpiece could have been taking the egg there so it could absorb a lot of that magic, or, be safe in the protection of the city, and grow strong, and then eventually, become the replacement for Kraukatoric or any of the Elder Dragons that have been slain at that point. There's also the question of Gleam, Glint's other offspring, and you might think, oh yeah, Gleam could be here. We could be going to Tarir and Gleam would be there. Well, that doesn't quite work though, because if Gleam had found its way to Tarir, then surely the Exalted should already have been active before now. But they weren't. So still, what's going on with Gleam is even a bigger mystery right now. Does that just mean Gleam was killed? Or is there another place like Tarir that Gleam went to? But that's the idea. I think we'll have some kind of climactic battle where Morgemoth is trying to take on this city, and we have to defend it somehow, perhaps. There is mechanically a cool little idea here. We're getting a bunch of new areas to explore in the expansion, but are we getting any safe areas? Are we getting any, Divinity's Reach equivalents? And perhaps this could serve as, a mechanical city of some kind. It sounds like it's very deep down in the jungle, because they describe not even really being able to see what time of day it is anymore. So it could be kind of an interesting setup where you have a map that is simultaneously a PvE map, on a couple of the biomes above, but then deep underground, it's the same map, but it's also like a super safe area down below there, and we can just hang out with the Exalted. This is probably where, of course, in Tarir, we'll get to do the daily, and the Mastery Track describes the Golden City. What else is there to talk about? Well, there are a few questions on my mind. Something I don't necessarily like about this story is, why are the Exalted humans? I haven't really seen many people asking this question, but I don't think it quite fits. Now, as much as I want to see more cool stuff to do with humans, because the humans, to me, are one of the most interesting parts of this franchise. But if you really think about it, okay, what the hell did Glint see in the humans? The Forgotten were said to have been, caretakers of the world that were pushed further and further and back by the other races' expansion until they were just in the Crystal Desert. And we can maybe attribute some of that to human activity. When we saw Glint's lair in Guild Wars 1, yes, we the player characters did seek an audience with her and she sought to help us out. But all we really saw for evidence of other humans having met with her were dead Ascalonians in her lair. Like, randomly, there were just bodies of them. Now, perhaps that doesn't really mean very much, but it certainly seems that barely any humans were hanging around the Crystal Desert at all. Any who had tried to go there and build civilizations had just died and fallen laid waste. And Glint had just always been hanging out there, right? We didn't seem to know even about her existence. At around that same time, we do also hear about a whole sect of dwarves who absolutely were working with Glint, and who were interested in Glint, and who were interested in tapping into her prophetic nature and using that for practical purposes, the Brotherhood of the Dragon. These guys were working heavily with Glint, and so, right, you are Glint 50 years before Guild Wars 1. Why do you care about the humans? Why is it the humans of everyone else that you seek out to become Exalted? I really don't know. Maybe ArenaNet didn't want it to be the dwarves because they've already established that the dwarves transformed to stone, and they thought it might confuse people that there's also a story where the souls of some other dwarves became exalted. But I think it's the story that makes more sense. Maybe you guys have a comment of your own on that. To talk a little bit more about the Mursaat stuff, I do think it deserves a bit of discussion, as so many of us were so heavily believing this could be what we were seeing. You have to remember that the early speculation about the idea that these Exalted could be Mursaat has little to do with the physical design of the creatures. Yes, they do look physically quite similar, and I think it's disingenuous at this point to look back and say, oh, how could anybody have believed these were the Mursaat? They don't even look like Mursaat. They do look fairly similar to the Mursaat, and it would be wrong to suggest that character design and creature designs from the first game have never changed when going to the second game. Hell, just look at the difference between the Asura in the first game versus the second. Look at something as big as the Oak Hearts, alright? Between the first game and the second. It was absolutely possible, but the more compelling reasons for this to be Mursaat was because of this idea of these ruins, was because the only other examples we've heard of golden cities was associated with the Mursaat. So now that we know that it's the Exalted instead, that's kind of interesting that there are so many similarities. How is it that the Forgotten were building beautiful golden cities, like the place we saw inside Augury Rock in GW1, like the cave we've seen in Season 2 of The Living World, like Tarir now, essentially, right? And also, the Mursaat were building those golden cities that were very similar too. In fact, look at the story again of Saul D'Alessio meeting the Mursaat, okay? He's banished from Kryta, and then we read this. Alone, broke and lost, Saul wandered through a dense forest for several days. We, by the way, the players, are not sure whether this forest is necessarily the Magua jungle or the forest to the north or what. Through a dense forest for several days, surviving on only roots and berries. On the fourth day, delirious with hunger, Saul emerged from the trees to see what he thought was a hallucination, a city of massive towers reaching into the heavens. The architecture was astounding, and the creatures who lived here were unlike any he'd ever seen. Walking down into their city, Saul got a closer look at the denizens of this place. They were tall and thin with strange wing-like appendages that waved about with the slightest breeze. When they walked, their feet seemed not to touch the ground, and when they spoke, it was the most melodious sound he'd ever heard. Surely these creatures were the stuff of divinity. Hungry and exhausted, his clothes ragged and dirty, he dropped to his knees, touched his forehead to the ground. He'd found his gods, and they in turn had found their most devoted disciple. I don't think it's disputable that this genuinely is talking about the Mursaat here, right? It would be kind of crazy to suggest that is an Exalted city, and these are Exalted that are being described. But it is funny that you can read that entire passage, and a Guild Wars 2 player might just immediately think it was referring to what is now associated with the Exalted instead. The similarities, bizarrely, don't end there either. When you look at the Forgotten in Guild Wars 1, the idea that the Forgotten could create magical constructs is not new. See, GW1 did an interesting thing where when we met Forgotten, the Forgotten were the spellcasting professions. They were monks, elementalists, mesmers, necromancers. And when we interacted with Forgotten who were rangers or warriors, right, the more physical based, instead of actually being snakes, they were instead constructs. They were enchanted armor. Enchanted armor that is even noted on the Guild Wars 1 wiki, as you can see here, as the fact that these enchanted bear resemblance to Mursaat armor. However, there is no relation between the two groups, of course, we've seen before. So this is something we already knew that the Forgotten did, and now kind of it seems like the Exalted are just super OP versions of the enchanted armor. But when you look at the Mursaat as well, the Mursaat too had the same thing. The actual real Mursaat we met generally were casters, monks, mesmers, elementalists, so forth. But if there were warriors or rangers, again, the Mursaat did the same thing that the Forgotten did. They had their own constructs, the Jade constructs, which you can see here. So they're so similar. Is this just because they're both ancient races? This doesn't even make mention of the Seers, who were the actual ones that seemed to be paired with the Mursaat and had like a lot of history going on between them. So hopefully the devs do shed a little more light on this when maybe one day we really do get some Mursaat story. Now, I don't want to rule out completely the Mursaat that might not be a part of Heart of Thorns. We do, of course, have the raid. Now, I find it kind of funny looking back at my comment just a couple of days ago saying, you know, that we might not even see Mursaat in the raid, because if we see Mursaat in the actual game, then waiting a few weeks for the Mursaat to be behind that wall that's being built in the raid doesn't really make that much sense, because, you know, the big payoff and the excitement of the Mursaat coming back may have already happened in the actual game. But now, it seems very unlikely it will happen in the actual game. I mean, it still might, but there's not much precedent for it anymore. So instead it could be like, alright, we got the Exalted and we got the Forgotten stuff. Then the Mursaat could be in the raid thing with the White Mantle. It seems interesting to me that before Heart of Thorns, in Season 2 of The Living World, they did so much setting up of the White Mantle, of the Bandits, of New Kryta. We've got a raid something to do with that, and somewhere roughly around the Bloodstone. And yet all the core story doesn't seem to have anything to do with that race whatsoever. So that's going to be really cool to see where that goes going forward. The Mursaat are cool, but I would rather they get like their own dedicated stuff instead of them just being sort of a minor part of the experience of Heart of Thorns when the plot primarily is dealing with something else, if that makes sense. I'll cap the video off by talking about some other similarities, because, yeah, there are some similarities to the Mursaat, which may not mean anything. There are also similarities to a lot of other things in the lore. So, what we're hearing about specifically here, guys, are humans who kind of physically change their forms, and their souls became bound to something else, and they become very powerful, right? In the Maguma jungle. Well, what else have we heard that's very similar to that? The Druids. Of course we've been hearing about the Druids. The Druids were said to have been a group of Crichtons who went to the Maguma jungle, and they went there to live with nature, and then eventually they just kind of all vanished, and nobody saw them anymore. And specifically, the last time they were supposed to have been seen was around just under 100 years before GW1. Here we're hearing that the Exalted were created about 50 years before Guild Wars 1. So, is it possible that the Druids are related to the Exalted? I don't think so. I mean, again, we've got very similar stories taking place in the same region of the world. There may be some connection going on here, but you have to remember that the Druids themselves, we've like met and we've spoken to, and even in Guild Wars 2, there's like a Druid you help escort to his husk, and they've never really given off any vibes or hint that they've ever known Glint or had any relation to the Forgotten or anything like that. So again, we've got a really similar story, but I'm going to hold before I say that they're connected. Many people have been looking at the Marganites as well. I think it's a little bit silly to talk about the Marganites. The Marganites, yes, were very magic-infused humans, sure, I've got you. But they've set up very clearly how the Marganites came to be, and I don't really think there's going to be much connection with this story to do with them. But more specifically, there's some cool stuff in Cantha. This idea, again, that you can kind of use a soul to place in a construct was something we saw twice in Cantha. Number one with the Juggernauts. The Kurziks of the Ekavald Forest learned a ritual in which they created these giant plant creatures called Juggernauts, and the Juggernauts were this exact same thing. They were humans that went through trials and rites. They sacrificed their mortal forms. Their souls were imbued into a new form, the Juggernaut, and they became very powerful, very durable, much like these Exalted are. And we also heard specifically about the Juggernauts too, and this is where the connection's really strong, that again, just like with the Exalted, these guys retained their personalities and their memories and so forth. The actual description between the Exalted and the Juggernauts matches up really closely. When I was first reading this blog post today, all I could think was Juggernauts originally. That's not it, though. In Cantha, we do, of course, also hear about Shiro Tagachi using his Shiroken to do something very similar. Again, this time it's against that soul's will, and they are becoming sort of enslaved and forced to fight for Shiro, rather than something they were actually choosing to do. So these are stories we've seen a lot of. There's a lot of odd similarities and very closely related stuff at the moment. And that is what makes this more interesting than anything else to me. I'd love to hear any theories you guys have. Please do try to remember as well that with videos like this, a lot of what I'm saying is speculation. I've always thought that's been very clear, but I've been getting a little bit frustrated recently with people kind of biting at me and telling me that I'm presenting stuff as fact when I'm not. So let's just go over this again. I'm having fun talking about a story for a game I enjoy, and that's pretty much as far as it goes. Draw your own conclusions. Let's have a talk about it in the comments below. I'd love to see you guys there, and I'll catch you tomorrow.